this little car made a massive mark, not just on the company that built it, but the entire sports car industry. The LOTUS ELISE. I want to rewind the clocks back to 1989 with the Elan M100. This was a brilliant two-door front-engined roadster. However, it was front-wheel drive. And while it was considered the greatest front-wheel drive car of all time in the handling department, that didn't matter. Especially because the rear-wheel drive roadster was just revived with the MX-5, which was significantly cheaper and more traditional than the Lotus, which meant that Lotus didn't get any sales of the Elan, and that caused a problem because, once again, typical British sports car manufacturer fashion, they were bankrupt, and they needed a new car that actually sold well. So in 1996, the Lotus head of design, Julian Thompson, and her chief engineer, Richard Rackman, designed the manifestation of the Lotus motto: simplify, then add lightness. It was a new sports car, weighing just 1,600 pounds, and standing just 47 inches tall. All it needed was a name: the Elise, named after the granddaughter of Lotus chairman. Like most Lotuses, it was not very fast. It had a 1.8-liter four-cylinder K-Series engine from Rover, making 118 horsepower. However, as I mentioned, it weighed just 1,600 pounds, which means it could do 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds. We all know Loti are not exactly dragster spec. No. It's all about the handling, and oh boy was this thing a joy. Because the center of gravity was just 18 inches off the ground, which means handling was incredibly nimble through the corners. There was no way to chuck it out of line. The center of gravity was nice and low, which meant you could take a corner so fast. Not hypercar fast, and it didn't pull an enormous amount of G's, but it was just so old-fashioned. You get a little four-wheel drifts going, you just sort of float it through the corners like an old Formula 1 car. It was a brilliant vehicle. The handling was revered, the brakes were some of the best in the world, and the fastest version in 1999, called the 111S, had a new variable valve control to increase power and smooth out the torque curve. It even had a rear spoiler and cross-drilled brakes. Before the turn of the century, this thing was a masterpiece of automotive handling, and it resurrected Lotus for all intents and purposes. I mean, Lotus might not exist without the Elise. It was their best-selling model ever, even more than the original Gordon Murray Elan, and yet it was brutally simple. There were no groundbreaking innovations, there were no revolutionary changes. It just encapsulated the Lotus motto: simplify, then add lightness. And some models took that a bit more extreme than others. Enter the 340R. It has been described as an Elise dialed up to 11. The body was replaced with a plastic shell that emitted useless weight-adding things, like roof, or windows, or a door, or the interior, or fenders, or all that stuff. So you didn't get much. But what you did get was 180 horsepower, and a curb weight of just 1,500 pounds in a road car. It's one of the lightest road cars ever made. And only 340 of them were ever made. It's an amazing machine. It actually has a 340 horsepower per ton ratio, hence the name. It's amazing. I love it. But believe it or not, this space-age looking go-karts is not the most extreme Elise Series 1. That honor belongs to the Elise GT1. You see, Lotus had been competing in FIA GT racing with the Esprit since 1994. But as the GT1 Le Mans series evolved, this Esprit started coming up against Ferrari F40 LMs and McLaren F1 GTs, and it did not have an answer for it. But then they had Brainwave. Following the launch of the Porsche 911 GT1, which was sort of a 911-ish, maybe, Lotus decided to follow suit, and they used the Elise as a sort of benchmark in 1997. The chassis was lengthened, widened, and made out of aluminum. A carbon fiber body, sort of resembling a stretched-out Elise, was then fitted on top, and they threw in a Chevrolet-sourced LT5 V8, making 600 horsepower. And the road car still weighed just 2,300 pounds and was fitted with a custom-spec Lotus-derived 3.5-liter twin-turbo V8, making 550 horsepower. Which means no matter if you're on the road version or the race version, the top speed was 200 miles an hour. If you could actually reach it, because the vehicle is so horrifically unreliable that it probably wouldn't even have time to get up to that speed before it broke down. And that reliability was a massive problem and had little to no racing success of any kind. And as far as the road cars are concerned, per FIA homologation, Lotus only had to make some road cars, which they interpreted as one. And that hasn't been seen in the public eye in 10 years. So good luck getting your hands on it. You could get your hands on the Series 2, however, when that launched in 2001. Now, European regulations, bloody European regulations, were redesigned for improved crash safety, and the 1,600-pound Elise was not what you would call safe in an accident. The crumple zone was mainly your face. So they ended up partnering with GM to completely redesign the Elise. It was a bit heavier for sure, a bit bigger, 2,000 pounds, but it was still phenomenally handling. And in the US, yes, it was actually sold here in the US, thank you, it got a brand new Toyota 4-cylinder making 190 horsepower. And as it moved forward in the 2000s, it actually gained amenities like electric windows, headlights that didn't melt in the sun, ABS, and airbags. Which is great when you're driving a track car because you're gonna crash it at some point. It's just a fact. Of course, all of that is heavy. So how are you gonna deal with all of that weight? Well, you add a supercharger to it, pushing power to 217, and then dropping the 0 to 60 in under 5. This thing was a proper rocket ship, despite the fact it made less power than my current Fusion. That is the benefits of power to weight. And it does all this while still being relatively affordable for a track car, and phenomenally handling despite the 2,000-pound weight, which is just ridiculous, by the way, being so heavy. Which is why one would think the Series 3 would be the worst of the bunch, because it's even heavier than the Series 2 when it came out in 2011. The base model kept the 217 horsepower supercharged Toyota engine, while getting a little bit of a styling refresh, bring it more into, you know, the decade. But despite the fact that it was pushing 2,300 pounds, it was still regarded as the benchmark for how a car should handle, and more importantly, how it should communicate that handling to the driver. You see, it had skinny 195 tires, which are enough to give you grip for such a light vehicle, but not enough to make it numbing, not enough to make it feel like you could drive upside down. It still allows you to feel every little shimmy in the vehicle. It's phenomenal. Keeping the entire car balanced, not one part overshadowing the other. That is the entire philosophy of the Elise, perfectly embodied down. Of course, It still does 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds if you're the base model. But of course this is Lotus, and they love to make special edition Elises. So they make a lot of them, with the king of the road being the 260 Cup, which makes 250 horsepower. I don't know. But it does 0 to 60 in 3.9 seconds, and it has a fancy schmancy new aero kit that generates 400 pounds of downforce. Not bad. Certainly helps you through the corners if you want to carry some truly mad corner speeds in your little lightweight Lotus. But you won't be able to do that for long, because after 25 years, the Elise is finally getting retired. It's sad because this is a vehicle that kept Lotus on the map. Everyone knew Lotus was pretty good at handling and tuning cars up. The Carlton, the Talbot Sunbeam, the Elan, all these other vehicles are phenomenal machines. But they weren't making any money. And they were on the verge of financial ruin. And this car single-handedly saved the entire company. That doesn't happen too often. And it stayed virtually the same for 25 years. Which I think is why people forget about it. Because if you look at the greatest sports cars of all time, certainly in the last 30 years, chances are no one would say the Lotus Elise. But it defined its segment. It is the Mustang of track cars. Sure, there's better versions out there. Sure, there's cheaper versions. But nothing perfectly embodies the specific car class that it's in than the Lotus Elise. And it was so good it perfected its own formula in 1996. So when this car gets replaced by the electric versions that they're coming up with, don't be sad. The electrification I'm generally not a big fan of. But with the Lotus, I think it's a brilliant addition because while the Elise will be retiring, it set the foundations for a hopefully successful Lotus, where we don't have to constantly worry about financial woes. And everyone says, that is a proper sports car manufacturer. If you were saddened by the memory lane that we just went down on the Elise and its legacy for Lotus, don't be, because you can still technically buy an Elise, even if it's not called the Elise. Because the Elise platform has been shared with a dozen cars over its 25-year run, with the likes of the Exige, the Europa, the 211. Hennessy used the Elise as the basis for their 1,400 horsepower, 270 mile an hour Hennessy Venom GT hypercar. And that GM partnership for the Series 2 Elise led to the foundations of the Vauxhall VX220. Hell, the entire fun electric car genre was invented when Tesla used the Elise as their foundation for the Roadster. And in a more quirky sense, the Elise has even been built into a fully functioning submarine called the Rinspeed Scuba. And who knows, maybe Caterham will buy up the rights to the Elise, just like they bought up the rights to the old Lotus 7 and continue producing it under the Caterham name. Whether that's confirmed or not, I have no clue, it's just speculation, but it would not be out of the realm of possibility. So, is the Siege truly dead? Officially, yes. But spiritually, it may just be getting started.